Hi everybody and welcome back. This is episode 2 of Lessons from a Dad. Or is it Lessons with a Dad? I'm not quite sure. But I do know that this is episode 2. So this episode we're learning about saws. Not everything about saws. I know the title is a little misleading, but we're learning about saws today. So just a little bit of a background for those of you who didn't see episode 1. Hint, hint, link up here. This is a basic video series that I've started. I teach my son stuff all the time, things that I've learned. Again, those of you who saw episode 1, you'll understand I'm not an expert. I'm just a guy that knows stuff, okay? I have picked things up along the way and I'm teaching it to my son now. I understand that there's a lot of boys and young men who may not have dads or men in their life to teach them certain skills. That's where this video series comes in. So if you're an expert, it's not for you. But I will give you a little bit of a call to action, let's say. If you know something basic about saws that you learned early on, or maybe you just even learned recently that is really helpful to you, leave a comment down below. Let it be something useful that boys or young men just starting to learn the basics will find really helpful. All right? That's the basic premise behind this episode. Let's get started. All right, so just like in video 1, when we talked about hammers and pliers and hand tools and stuff, you got to know some of the basic lingo when it comes to saws. So the basic knowledge that comes in with saws, first thing you need to know, and you'd be shocked how many people I run into that don't recognize this. Saws remove material. Scissors, knives, they separate material. That's a big difference because when you think about it, where do you think all the sawdust comes from? You don't have scissor dust, you don't have knife dust, you have sawdust. That's because you're actually removing material. This material that you remove leaves something. It's called the kerf, K-E-R-F. You'll see it there. This kerf is where you actually remove that material with your blade, whatever blade you're using. We'll get to all the blades in a minute, different kinds of saws. But you're removing material. So when you're actually doing the cutting, you need to remember that kerf, okay? First thing you need to be absolutely sure of is what length are you cutting to, okay? So anytime you mark a length, you need to know which side you're keeping and which side you're getting rid of. That way you can use that saw blade kerf to cut on the right side of that line, okay? And by right, I mean correct. All right, cut on the correct side of the line, because if you're cutting on one side of the line that's wrong, you're taking away material. So it's going to be a little shorter than what you think. You want to either, so I know people that will cut the line, so you're losing about a 1/16 of an inch. I know people that will cut it precisely and you're getting the exact length that you need. I don't know anybody that cuts on the wrong side and loses that, because most saw blades in power saws are about 1/8 of an inch. When you get into hand saws, they're usually a little thinner, they're a lot thinner, but you're losing material. All right, so that's the basic knowledge that you need to know about the kerf, okay? So pretty much everything else lingo-wise we're going to get into when we talk about the actual saws. The first thing we need to differentiate between is that we have power tools and we have hand tools, just like everything else. We're going to start with some basic knowledge about hand saws. What we've got is, if we look at hand saws, you have two basic categories. You have what's called a push saw and you have what's called a pull saw. I use a pull saw, okay? So this is it. It's a Japanese pull saw. You will find that most pull saws come from Asia. Most push saws come from Europe and the US. I have no idea. I haven't looked into the great detail about why that's the case, but it is. I recommend a pull saw to people just starting out. It's a little bit easier to get the hang of learning quickly. I grew up using a push saw. My dad had my granddad's big carpenter saw, and it was a big push saw. Nobody ever took any care of it, so it was difficult to use. It had a little bit of rust on it. It didn't glide easily. You had to really have some force. It would bind a lot. So I grew up not liking the push saws. So the good thing is you can buy these pull saws. They're razor sharp. If you mess it up, you can buy a replacement blade that's just as sharp. I'll leave an affiliate link down below for an Amazon link. This saw, I think, 20, 25 bucks or something like that. I can't get a really good quality push saw for 60, 70, $80. And I think I like the pull saws because I think they're a little bit easier to use, a little bit easier to learn on. So, one thing you should know, both push saws and pull saws, they come in what's called a rip saw and what's called a crosscut saw. A rip saw, you're cutting along the line of the grain. A crosscut saw, you're cutting perpendicular to the grain, so you're cutting across. This saw, it's actually got both on the same blade. So these really fine teeth that overlap a little bit, this is my crosscut. My rip, on the other hand, it's got a little bit bigger teeth that have a little bit more spacing. So the more spaced out they are, the less what we call TPI, okay? Teeth per inch, all right? A crosscut saw will tend to have a higher TPI. A rip saw will tend to have a lower TPI, okay? It's just the way it goes pretty much on anything until you get to the power tools. And then we'll talk about those when we get there. I'm pointing over there at my power tools if you can't figure it out. So, basics, push saw, pull saw, rip saw, crosscut saw. So now let's move on to powered saws. So powered saws, you can pretty much get any specialty saw that you want. They come in pretty much any shape, size, power rating. They even come in hardwired versions. The only problem is when you want a hardwired version, you're pretty much going to pay to get it. There are really, really good ones, but you can easily pay $4,000 to $10,000 or $12,000. I would recommend just going to a box store, Home Depot, Lowe's, even Amazon. You can get good stuff on there. But I would, as with a hand saw, I would recommend getting the best quality one that you can afford. All right? It doesn't have to be the most expensive, but get one with some capabilities and get the best quality one in the capability range that you can afford. Okay? It's going to work better, it's going to work for a longer period of time, and you're going to get better quality results out of it. So, a lot of people focus on amperage in the motor. Just because something is a 14 versus a 13 amp motor, 16 versus an 18, it's not as big a deal as people make it out to be. You know, you don't have to go for the highest amperage. Oftentimes you get a more powerful motor, but without getting too far into the electrical side of it, companies can do things to have a 16 amp motor perform as good as an 18 amp motor if they do the right things. So we're not going to get into all that, but as we look at our basic power tools, you still have to look at TPI, okay, the teeth per inch. If you have something like I have here, I've got two saw blades, okay? These are round saw blades. This is one from a circular saw. This is a 10-inch from my miter saw. It's an old one I inherited from my dad, actually. These are relatively low TPI. They are really good for rough work, basic, just chopping things up, okay? The higher TPI that you get, the more fine work you're going to do. You'll see some videos, and I'll show you my miter saw. I've got, I think, a 70 TPI blade on there because I use my miter saw more for what we would call finish work. And you want a good clean cut. So that higher TPI, it doesn't cut as fast through the material, but you get a good clean cut with it. Something like this with a relatively low TPI, you cut faster through it, but you get a rough edge on it, okay? So still the same thing pretty much with any saw. So let's get to talking specifics about saws. The first saw that most people will come in contact with is what we call a circular saw. Okay, it's a handheld power saw. They come in a lot of different designs, but the two main designs that people will come across is what we would call a sidewinder and then what we would call a worm drive. So what a worm drive saw is named after the worm gear. The sidewinder is usually more from the central area of the U.S. over to the East Coast. I'm not really sure why. More on the West Coast, you'll see a lot of worm drive saws being used. I grew up with a sidewinder. It's what my dad had. It's what I have now. Although I'm really thinking from a usability standpoint, a lot of the things I do, I might want a worm drive saw because the handle is actually behind, and I like the human factor side of it. It's a little bit more easily user-friendly. It kind of depends on what you want to do. The worm drives, because of that worm gear, they'll typically have a little bit more torque. So, you know, do you need a lot of torque? It depends on the cutting that you do. The sidewinder usually will have a little bit higher RPM, and it's what we call a direct drive. The motor's on the side and it drives the blade itself. There's very little interchange. A little bit higher RPM. Again, there's good and bad for this. Most of the time the sidewinders will be a little bit more compact, a little bit lighter. It's not always the case, but on the average saw, a little bit more compact, a little bit lighter for the sidewinders. A little bit heavier until you get to the magnesium ones for the worm drive. It's just the mechanism's a little bit bigger. Again, I have a sidewinder, but I'm really thinking about moving towards a worm drive just because I like the usability of it. The thing about whichever one you choose, you can do most of the cuts that you might need with a circular saw. You can do cross cuts, you can do rip to a certain extent, you can do angled cuts, you can do cheek cuts, you can do rabbets, sort of. I like to cut big sheet goods. Like, I know it's a DIY project right now. They're all really it's really in right now, and use big sheet goods, big sheets of plywood. I prefer, because I don't have a big, powerful table saw, I cut my sheet goods with my circular saw. I get a straight edge and I run along the straight edge. You get a really good cut with the right blade. You just chug along, cut it up how you need it. Instead of using my little table saw where I've got to kind of finagle things to get it on there and it's probably a little underpowered, I use my circular saw and it does really, really well. For a long time, the only saw I had was a circular saw. And I would say probably 70 or 80% of the things I did, I got it done. And that's great. If that's all you have, get a good one. Don't cheap out on it. I'm saying a lot right now, I'm recognizing that. Let's see how I do for the rest of the video. So it's all about your skill level, okay? One usability tip that I'll give, and I was hoping somebody might leave this in the comments because I wasn't going to say it until right now, but I remembered a story from whenever I was younger. Any electrical saw, whenever you start using it, always start it, whether it's pulling the trigger on a miter saw or a circular saw, always start it with whatever substrate you're trying to cut away from the blade. Let everything build up RPMs and then run it through, okay? That's an easy tip that a lot of people don't think about. A circular saw has a few basic parts. They're all interchangeable. When I say interchangeable, I don't mean you can take one from one and put it on the other. That's not what I mean. But the terminology is interchangeable. So You've got a shoe, you've got the blade guard, you've got a depth adjustment, you've got some sort of trigger or an angle adjustment, and then you've got a blade lock so you can take your blade on and off like I did with this one, okay? Again, this is my old circular saw blade. So those are the same basic parts across any circular saw that you're gonna get. So just keep in mind, whenever you have a circular saw, it's about your creativity with the cuts that you're gonna be making, okay? You can make a lot of cuts. You just have to be really thoughtful about how you're making them. So the next saw we're going to talk about is what's called a miter saw. There are several different variants of miter saws that you need to be aware of. Everybody will see these. Most people kind of call them a chop saw, but the way I grew up, a chop saw is one that you chop and it's got an abrasive blade on it and you cut metal with it. There are specific metal saws. I'm not going to get into those right now. I'm mostly going to talk about the saws that you use with wood. A lot of times you can use certain saws on metal. You just got to have the right blade. So usually that's going to be a much higher TPI, okay? But focusing on miter saws for woodwork. So the basics that you will see, okay? You'll have what's called a single bevel. You'll have a dual bevel, you'll have a dual bevel sliding, and then you'll see a chop saw, okay? A lot of people really spend a lot of money on their miter saw, and that's great. You can do a lot of things with it. However, a lot of people I know, they just use it for basic angle cuts to get things square, to cut things to length, or to make a basic 45-degree angle cut. One of the things I wish I had is I wish I had a sliding, because you can bring it out and cut a little bit wider. I've got a single bevel. You'll see in the videos that I'm going to cut in here. My single bevel, it can tilt one way and then it can turn and cut a multiple angle in the same cut. So I honestly have only tilted the bevel twice. I use the 45-degree angle feature fairly regularly, but I do wish I had that slide action, because I can pull it out and slide it and run basically almost sheet good through it. Again, I told y'all earlier I inherited this saw. I inherited it from my dad many years ago. It's probably 20 plus years old now. I just haven't felt the need to buy a new one. It served me really well. I've put new blades on it. I've got Milwaukee on it right now with a 70 TPI. Works great. I've got no complaints about it. Like I said, it's a 10-inch. I wish I had a 12-inch, and I wish I had the sliding function. Really though, it does everything I ask it to do as just a basic homeowner. If I were doing more DIY projects, I might go out and invest in something like that. And by DIY, I mean like building furniture type DIY stuff, but I don't. So this gets me through just fine. The basics, again, the basic layout, the bevels and the sliding. The other thing you need to know is you can get a 10-inch or a 12-inch. They do make smaller ones, but don't get any smaller than a 10-inch. If you can afford a 12-inch, it's really nice. Just be aware that as you buy new blades for a 12-inch, the 12-inch blades cost more than the 10-inch blades. The only problem with having a miter saw is if you don't have a lot of articulation, you're limited in what you can do with it. The circular saw, you're limited by your creativity. This, you're limited by design, okay? But again, if I think about it outside of hand saws, if I think about power tools, the miter saw was the second thing that I got. And it's served me really well, and I use it all the time. So next up we have a jigsaw. This is my jigsaw. There are many like it, but this is mine. See if y'all get that reference. This is a jigsaw. A jigsaw is a reciprocating saw. It's just like a sawzall. Y'all will see sawzalls. Sawzall is actually the Milwaukee name of it, but everybody makes one. But a reciprocating saw is about the action of the saw. The blade here just goes up and down. Everything in a Sawzall is about blade choice. You can choose a metal blade, a wood blade. This is a wood blade. This is a wood blade. They're just different TPIs. Again, TPI is something we're keep coming back to. These two are basically the same blade. Okay. This one is just longer. I can do that with this because it's got a really powerful motor. You'll notice that this may not look like all other jigsaws, but there is some common themes. There is still a shoe. It's just like a circular saw. You'll have the shoe, and then it will kind of go off of there. What you'll notice with a jigsaw is the shoe's not as adjustable as the circular saw, but you can change the angle of your shoe plate, so you can get different angled cuts. I hate to say all because all is a big term, but there's mainly two adjustments on every jigsaw. You'll have your orbital and you'll have your speed. Okay, both of these, most of the time, I leave my speed all the way up unless I'm cutting metal. The orbital, I change it all the time based on what I'm doing, okay? If you have a low orbital setting, it's basically just going straight up and down. If you have a high orbital setting, it's doing kind of like this as it goes up and down, all right? It's going in an orbit. So the good and bad about the orbital setting, if you just need to make a rough cut really fast, put it on a high orbital setting. It removes a lot of material. If you need a fine cut to where you might actually see what's going to be there, put it on a low orbital setting. It removes less, it goes slower, but it does have a better finish, okay? You'll notice that my design is a little bit different. I like this. This is called a barrel. There is one that's called a hand over. I think that's what most people would normally have. It's got a handle up top. I personally don't like that because what you've got is your hand is really, really far away from the actual cutting. I feel like I have more control of this barrel. It is a little bit heavier, but I haven't ever found that to be an issue. As far as usability with the jigsaw, again, number one, blade choice, choose correctly. If you need to cut metal, you can cut metal. If you need to cut tile, you can cut tile. If you need to cut wood, you can cut wood. The basic cuts that you're going to do with a jigsaw, it's really good for radiuses. It's really good if you need to cut a radius or cut a hole or something in the middle of something. You can drill a pilot hole, put your blade down in there, turn it on, just like all the other saws. Don't turn it on when it's touching the substrate, the material. Put it in the middle of the hole, turn it on, cut your radius. You can cut a radius from pretty much anywhere you need. You can do a plunge cut if you can hold the material down firmly enough. That's a much more advanced technique. I wouldn't recommend doing that unless you have used it a lot. You can, one of the things the jigsaw is really good at, aside from radiuses, is meeting 2 points where you don't need any overcut. Okay, overcut will sometimes happen with a circular blade, and I don't get any overcut. It's just a really nice clean cut, and that's what jigsaws are really good for. Again, all about blade choice, orbital setting, and again, I don't ever touch my speed. All right, last but not least, we got table saws. Table saws are probably the last thing you should purchase, mostly because to get a good one, it's going to be your biggest investment. I will already hear the comments that some miter saws are just as expensive as table saws, and that's true. However, I would say for most users, the table saw is probably going to be the most dangerous. I'm a big believer in data. There's more table saw related injuries in the US than any other woodworking tool. So go get a table saw when you feel like you're ready for a table saw. Again, buy the best one that you can afford, but be aware, you know, a couple $100 may or may not get you a good one. You might have to spend a little bit more money than that. So let's go over the basic parts, okay? You've got a work table, a blade, a bevel adjustment, a height adjustment, and those are the main things that most people are going to see, okay? You can get a lot of different cuts out of just those adjustments and understanding how to use your table saw. You can do rip cuts, you can do cross cuts, you can do bevel cuts, you can do different joints. It's really nice. You can do rabbets, which kind of just removes a little bit of an edge. If you want to talk about joints, we'll make another video about that. You can do kerfing, which kerfing is really interesting. You cut little kerfs, but you don't cut all the way through the wood, and basically you can make it to where wood bends. You can do lap joints. You can do a lot of different things with a table saw, but you have to be very, very aware of the blade and kickback and stuff like that. So it's kind of a usability issue for most people. You got to get really comfortable with it. You'll see in all these videos that are running through right now, I don't have the top guard on mine, but you can see during these videos that I've got running through, you can do a lot of different things, and I'm doing a lot of good, interesting things. Most people like to pick a blade very similar to their miter saw. You can pick a blade that suits what you're looking to do, the right TPI. I've just got a rough blade on mine, so you'll see in these videos, it's not making super clean cuts, but it's okay. I don't need it to. I don't do a lot of fine woodworking on my table saw. Like I said, I use my miter saw, and I've got a high TPI blade for my circular saw. But be aware, you need to have a lot of respect for all tools, but you need to have a lot of respect for a table saw. I personally have known more people get injured by a table saw than any other saw that you might be using. That's it, folks. That's all we're going to cover today. I understand there's lots of other different kinds of saws out there. There's scroll saws and band saws and reciprocating saws, and there's a lot of good saws that you might need to use. This is a good place to get you started. We talked about some basic hand saws. We talked about the difference between a push and a pull. We talked about some different kinds of power saws, table, miter, circular, and jig. We talked about some different terminology. We talked about what a kerf is. We talked about what TPI is. So you've got a lot of good information to move forward, and that's the purpose of this video. It's to move you forward. It's not to make you an expert. I'm not an expert, but it's to move you forward in the basic knowledge of saws. And hopefully we did that today. If you liked the video, be sure and like and subscribe. I've got another one planned coming out next week about drills, bits, and impact drivers. We will be moving away from tools eventually. It's just tools is a good, nice, easy place for me personally to start. We will move on to other things, I promise. So leave a comment on things that you might like to see. Like and subscribe. We'll see you next week.